ongoing in the country, especially in Almaty, still many unknown. So I think we need some modesty and humility in analyzing what is going on, but it's also very important to try to put together the different pieces of the puzzle that we have so far. And so for that, we have five great speakers who will be able to give us their vision of what has been happening and some kind of clue about how to interpret that. We wanted to have speakers directly from Kazakhstan, but as you may know, internet is not working or working only in the morning, Kazakh time. So there was no way to get them at this kind of late evening time currently. But our speakers will be able to share a lot with us today. So we will have first Mehrat Saribjanov, who is the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Newsroom senior correspondent and former director of the Kazakh service. Then Timur Omarov, research consultant at Carnegie Moscow Center. Pauline Jones, professor of political science and director of the Digital Islamic Studies curriculum at the University of Michigan. Barbara Jonisbai, associate professor at Pitzer College. And Nargis Kasenova, senior fellow and director at the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. I will give them the floor, each of them, for about 10 minutes. And during that time, I invite you to begin asking questions in the chat box. And then at the end, so in about 50 minutes, we will have time for the Q&A. We will go not for 60 minutes, but for 90 minutes. And so we should have about half an hour for a discussion, and I will be moderating the Q&A session. Once again, welcome, and Mehrat, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm greeting everyone from Prague, Czech Republic. Unfortunately, today's topic is not a very good one for myself personally, because it's about my country, Kazakhstan. What happened last week shocked everyone, of course, even people who were by their profession following the events and developments there. We got used to regular protests in Zhanaozen and oil regions in Kazakhstan, which happened from time to time, but we never expected that this will lead to something that would happen. In the beginning, it looked like the protests were supported by other regions close to the region, close to Zhanaozen and further on, but gradually the protest was hijacked by unknown individuals. In very controversial statements, President Tokayev called them terrorists, even international terrorists, giving the number, which is ridiculous for everyone, 20,000 international terrorists operating under command of a single center attacked Almaty only. That's for anyone who is a grown-up person is incredible to believe. As a person who served in the Soviet army, for myself, 20,000 troops is impossible to believe, or whoever they are. For me personally, it looks like some part of protesters, people who came from the regions which are the poor regions, impoverished regions, most likely some of the protesters might started this kind of violence, but I also believe that there were some groups organized by the government controlled groups, and as it usually was during the Soviet time, the KGB organized provocations which with a goal to discredit the protests, where the tactics of that kind were used here as well. We also can say that some kind of tug of war between Tokayev and other groups, I mean elite groups close to Nazarbayev, most likely had taken place. The thing is that we know that Karim Mosimov, one of the closest allies of Nazarbayev, was arrested. He was the chairman of KNB, Committee for National Security, And today we just learned that one of his closest associates, Almaty the colonel, was found dead, most likely committed suicide. Regional police chief in Jambil region also committed suicide, according to the reports. And the officials confirmed that he died, but they didn't say how and what circumstances. I think many things coincided here. The protests erupted, the protests were hijacked, and then the standoff between Tokayev and Nazarbayev's people somehow took place as well. And the question is why? Where is Nazarbayev himself? Is he in a very grave condition? That's why his associates started trying to remove Tokayev. We still didn't see him. We don't know what happened to him. We don't know where he is. We know that his press secretary, Aydos Ukimbai, said that he is okay. He never left Kazakhstan, and he calls all Kazakhstanis to support Tokayev. So, in this very situation, of course, Russia used this opportunity, and some deal was made, and the CSTO troops, for the first time in the history of this organization, were sent to Kazakhstan, which was admitted in a very controversial way by many in Kazakhstan, of course. Many compared with the intrusion of the Soviet troops, Warsaw Pact troops, to Czechoslovakia in 1968. Some compared with the situation in Belarus, and many other. We cannot say for sure what really is happening there, because the information is very, very. We lack the complete information, because among all these reports, the statements like 20,000 troops or terrorists coming to Almaty only, they don't give us any ground to believe anything the government says. And also, we don't know if when they say Masimov is arrested, we just remember how in 2005, the former mayor of Almaty, Zamanbek Nurkadilov, was found dead with 2 slugs in his heart and then 1 slug in his head, and it was pronounced as a suicide. So to trust to whatever the government says, it's very hard. Altenbek Sarsenbayev, who was killed in 2006 with his 2 associates, the opposition figure. Also, there were trials. One person was sentenced as an organizer, and then it turned out he has nothing to do with this. And then Rahat Aliyev, presidential son-in-law, is pronounced as a suspect, and he was found dead in the Austrian jail. And all this, that don't give any grounds to believe whatever the government is now saying. And of course, during today's session of the CSTO member states officials, when Vladimir Putin and Tokayev again reiterated there was a international terrorist group, international external forces attack to Kazakhstan, were sounded completely groundless for many who knows Kazakhstan and who follows the developments there. The most important thing, of course, is that everything is under control now, and we'll see what's going to happen. And if Tokayev is still in power, I think he will try to get rid of Nazarbayev's people to the end. That's my thinking. And most hopefully, he will probably start some reforms he promised. That's the only thing I can tell for right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mehtar, for kind of launching the discussion. As I said, the knowledge we have can only be very partial and fragmented. So I think it's giving us a good idea on how to begin the discussion. And I now would like to give the floor to Timur.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Merhat for this great introduction. I also want to say that we really have not much of information right now to make any conclusions. But from we already see, considering all of the internet disconnections and blockages in Kazakhstan, I see that the official statements that are made right now, I don't think that they have objective behind them, because when we listen to Tokayev and all of the state media and some expert communities, they all say right now that it was a planned, organized terrorist attack with the goal to make a coup to take Tokayev down. But for me, there are many holes in this theory. First of all, if we look at how coups are organized in other countries like Kyrgyzstan, as we all know, these happens quite differently. If it really was a coup, why everything happened in Almaty, not in Astana, not in Nur Sultan? Why protesters chaotically destroyed just infrastructure, roads, cars, supermarkets? It doesn't look like very organized group of people who have one particular goal. For me, it was really a protest that went too far and went very, very radical. And the main reason for that is that why the government didn't expect it is that government just lost sense of what society thinks about the government, what is the level of support in the society. And this miscommunication led to this unexpected situation. Now we see that President Tokayev uses this very dangerous situation in his own favor, as it looks from not inside but outside of Kazakhstan. But again, we shouldn't forget that apart from his consolidation of power, apart from him right now becoming more influential player inside Kazakhstan, there are also very big risks for him. First of all, let's not forget that Tokayev was put to his current position by President Nazarbayev, who is very unpopular, as it seems right now. So it is not true that people will forget that Tokayev is associated with Nazarbayev, or if he gets rid of Nazarbayev and his people from the government, the people will be okay with that. People still think that he is a part of the system, and it's not just enough to get rid of Nazarbayev as a head of Security Council. There also should be other steps taken. And during the protests, we heard people saying that they need new elections and new political reforms. And I think this is what people will be demanding in the future. Another risk for Tokayev's position in Kazakhstan's political future is that right now he relies on Moscow much more than he used to, and much more than Nazarbayev used to. I mean, Kazakhstan for years has been known as this very good example of multivectoral foreign policy. Kazakhstan was always a place where all Russia, China, and the Western countries could find a middle ground, could work together, and it was not a country where the balance between those three main geopolitical actors was in a big conflict. Kazakhstan always managed to balance between those. But now, when Tokayev asked CSTO, and obviously for everyone, CSTO is a Russian-led organization. We cannot say that CSTO is a an organization where all of the parties have similar power. Tokayev will owe Moscow his legitimacy, his position, and this will, of course, mean that Moscow will have much more influence on not only foreign policy of Kazakhstan in the future, but also in domestic affairs. And for Kazakhstan's future, I think it means that we will, in the nearest future, see some very similar political moves that we saw in Russia after protests, that we saw in Belarus after 2020. We will see a lot of new cases against activists that were seen during the protest. I will not be surprised if we will see any new laws against NGOs, against independent media. This will not be surprising for me. I will stop here and we'll be happy to answer any questions. I see we have a lot of them.
Thank you so much, Timur, for your comments. And I'm now giving the floor to Pauline.
Sorry about that. I think I was still muted. Thank you so much, Marlene. Thank you to the organizers. And thank you, Timur. You set this up perfectly for me because I really want to shift focus away from trying to understand current events and how they unfolded to what this all means for the future of Kazakhstan. And as Marlene said, we don't have, and others have said, we don't have all the information. And so I am being speculative a bit about what I think this means for the future. I don't think it's bright, I will say that. But I think what we can do, or what we should do, is think of this moment, this historical moment, as the end of a political transition that began in 2019. Put differently, what I mean by that is 2019 was Nursultan Nazarbayev's first exit from power, and 2022 seems to be his second exit from power. And the nature of this second exit, I think, has much broader implications for where Kazakhstan seems to be headed. So how does Nazarbayev's second exit differ from the first? I would say his first exit in 2019 was graceful, well-timed, and incomplete. It was graceful because rather than running for a sixth term in 2020, as everyone expected, Nazarbayev, who, as we know, was Kazakhstan's first post-Soviet president, he held the position for almost 30 years, resigned on March 19, 2019, and anointed then chairman of the Senate, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, his successor. Nazarbayev's first exit was also well-timed. If the goal, and I think it was to preserve his own legacy. Nazarbayev built his reputation on the perceived success of his model of development, which was predicated on stability and prosperity via economic liberalization and soft authoritarianism. But these gains had really peaked by the mid-2010s. And since roughly 2016, the economic situation in the country just continued to stagnate due to low oil prices, corruption, and constraints on the growth of the private sector. Not unrelated, Kazakhstan also during that period experienced increased popular discontent and political mobilization, forcing the government to utilize some of its sovereign wealth fund to both support the economy and to increase social spending. Clearly it wasn't enough, but there was some attempt. Finally, Nazarbayev's first exit was incomplete. He retained influence over the country in both formal and informal ways. Formally, he was named lifelong chairman of the National Security Council and leader of the ruling Nur Otan political party. Nazarbayev's second exit, I think, couldn't be more different from his first. It is dishonorable, ill-timed, and complete. Nazarbayev was forced out, as we know, in the wake of these mass protests that have swept through Kazakhstan since January 2nd of this year. And although these protests began in response to a steep rise in fuel prices in one part of the country, they quickly spread to many other parts of the country, and they escalated from economic grievances to concrete political demands. Foremost among these demands was for the regime to finally distance itself from Nazarbayev. President Tokayev responded not only by dismissing Nazarbayev from his formal position as chairman of the National Security Council, but also by attempting to remove Nazarbayev's political allies in the security apparatus and replacing them with his own. Although these actions and others that he took did not quell protests, they sent a strong signal that Nazarbayev is being held accountable for Tokayev's failure to implement needed and promised reforms. They have also, thus, I think, changed the meaning of Nazarbayev's legacy, of his intended legacy. Rather than being held up as the Almaty, the leader of the nation, and remembered for securing Kazakhstan's stability and prosperity, I think Nazarbayev will more likely be equated with Kazakhstan's fragility. And more so, given Tokayev's choice to repress protesters, to engage in brutal repression, and to invite foreign intervention to prop up his regime, Nazarbayev's second exit will also likely be associated with the country's violent turn and loss of sovereignty, as I think Timur alluded to perfectly. So what are the broader implications? I think I've indicated in a sense that they're not positive. I think that Nazarbayev's second exit signals three important points of departure in terms of Kazakhstan's future trajectory. The first is an end to soft authoritarianism. Tokayev has clearly, I think, taken the country in a more repressive direction. His decision to move swiftly to violent suppression of the protests and then order shoot to kill has opened the door to the use of state violence as a tool of regime stability. This is not to say that the previous regime never used violent repression. Of course they did, and there's an acute example in the very town where the January 22 protest started, Zhenozem, in Western Kazakhstan. That in 2011, police fired on and killed protesters. So I'm not suggesting that the former regime was not capable of this. But the regime, the Nazarbayev regime, the previous regime, also regretted this use of force and tried to learn from it. And so when there were larger demonstrations in 2014 after a currency devaluation, for example, and in 2016 in response to land privatization, the regime exercised restraint. So it wasn't a common tactic of the regime to use this kind of violent, brutal repression against peaceful protesters. Tokayev's repressive turn could also, I fear, bring an end to elections and political competition. Even if elections were rigged and even if political competition was limited, it at least gave some semblance of contestation and representation in this authoritarian regime, this soft authoritarian regime. I think Tokayev may be reluctant to hold elections, at least in the near future, for a few reasons. One, given the possibility of it serving as another focal point for popular mobilization and mass protests. We know that it commonly has across the former Soviet Union and outside of it. And he clearly doesn't deal well with mass protests. He may also be reluctant to hold elections because of what I think is a huge hit to his own popularity and legitimacy after the use of brutal force and after the call for outside military intervention, particularly of Russian troops. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The question remains, however, I think this is a crucial question that both of my colleagues raised in their remarks, is whether Tokayev will continue to choose repression over reform. Will he engage in the political and economic reform that is needed and that he has promised? Will he take the protesters' demands seriously? Calling them terrorists and sort of dismissing them as being orchestrated by foreign interests. It's a tactic, but is it something that he's internalized to the extent that he's going to continue to choose repression rather than to engage these, at least the initial protests, as legitimate calls for political and economic reform? And if he chooses reform, then he could possibly restore some of his popularity and legitimacy, which would make him more willing to hold elections in the future and allow some, at least some semblance of political competition. So it remains to be seen. The second key point of departure, I think, is, again, something Timur mentioned, the end of a multi-vector foreign policy. As Timur said, Nazarbayev had played a really expert sort of balancing act among different actors. He remained friendly towards Russia, but he also maintained really good relations with the West so that he could court Western leaders as well as energy companies. Tokayev's actions, I think, bring Kazakhstan further away from the West and closer not only to Russia, but also to China. This is not just a move or a turn toward more repressive authoritarianism and away from soft authoritarianism, but I think it's also clearly a turn toward authoritarian solidarity with Russia and China. By taking Kazakhstan's authoritarian regime in the direction of greater repression, I think it's now in lockstep with these two major authoritarian players in the region who have always wanted more influence in Kazakhstan. Russia has a physical boots on the ground, and of course this has serious implications both for the short and the long term. Even if the intervention is only short term, it has implications for popular discontent and thus for future popular mobilization. It also has, again, Timur mentioned this, it has implications for Tokayev's loyalty to Putin and thus for future key decisions that are about foreign policy and domestic policy. Tokayev's harsh response to protests was also explicitly embraced by the president of China. So we know that there's some support there, not just his violent suppression of the protests themselves, but his invitation to the Russian intervention. Finally, I think the third key point of departure is this is the end, it seems, of Kazakhstan's global image of stability, prosperity, and perhaps most importantly, sovereignty. This is an image that Nazarbayev very carefully, very expertly cultivated. And it was an image that was important both for international and domestic audiences because it helped secure the regime's legitimacy both at home and abroad. And so I think what this has meant internationally is a loss of credibility, at least in the West. It's also a strong signal to the West, as well as to other states in the post-Soviet region, that Russia will not hesitate to intervene in what it considers its sphere of influence. Domestically, I think the Russian troops can definitely cause a nationalist backlash. This is what I was referring to earlier about popular mobilization in response to this decision to allow foreign intervention. It also domestically, it can lead to a perceived loss of sovereignty, which is going to affect the regime's legitimacy, as I mentioned earlier, and thus possibly the continuation of this repressive authoritarian trajectory that Tokayev seems to have taken the country in. Thank you very much. And I'll end there and wait for questions.
Thank you so much, Pauline, for these great comments. Let's now give the floor to Barbara.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, wonderful. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I did want to acknowledge and give my recognition to those of you who are from Kazakhstan and have family and friends there. I know this is a really difficult time. So my ex-husband and my youngest are in Almaty, and I hadn't spoken to them for a week, and it was terrifying. So my heart goes out to all of you who have family and friends there. I would like to, many of my comments will be repetitious, I think, of what others have already said. But I'd like to think about this, acknowledging that we have very limited information. We come with our earlier frameworks, you know, how we see Kazakhstan based on our research and our understanding of the country and our disciplines. I would like to divide up how I'll share how I think about it in terms of different levels of analysis. So first, I would like to acknowledge the protesters. And my comments are also based on some conversations I had yesterday in the early morning and in the evening with folks who are in Almaty. And I'm going to focus mostly on what happened in that city. So let me show some photographs really quickly. Oops. Sorry, technical issues. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. And these are some photographs from early Thursday morning in the city of Almaty. So these were sent to me by a friend who is in the city right now. And their comments were that Wednesday night, there was massive looting in the city, and that it looked like the violence had overtaken the protesters, and that possibly the protesters were a different group than those who were violently engaged in destruction. It also looked to my friend that there was no military and no police around Wednesday evening, which I would like to return to in my narrative. So this is early Thursday morning after the destruction. Peaceful protesters are gathering on the square in Almaty, making plov for their community. We are a simple people. We are not terrorists. Tokayev soldiers leave. We are a peaceful people. And then again, Tokayev soldiers leave. We are a peaceful people. We are simple people. We are not terrorists. And that's that. So I wanted to start with that. So I think there are many things happening here. The first is that, yes, people are hurting. And I would agree completely with the things that have been said earlier, I think particular by Pauline and Mirhat, that Kazakhstan used to be a place where the middle class expected to grow and expand, and people expected that their life would get better. And I think this is really important for people who live in the cities, but it's also really important to note for Kazakh-speaking Kazakhs who come from the villages, who move to the cities to find a better life. There is a narrative in Kazakhstan that Kazakhstan is the place for Kazakhs. And yet we know that Kazakhs are the ones who are economically disadvantaged and suffering, and rural Kazakhs are doing terribly in Kazakhstan. I think it's also really interesting that Tokayev made a lot of his comments and speeches in Russian. So I've lived in Kazakhstan off and on for various times, and that kind of anger that I felt among Kazakhs who've moved to Astana or Almaty was there for a long, long time. So and then there's, people who, like in the, up to the mid 2000s, they expected that their life would get better. People would all have cars. That's why gas is so important, because everybody has a car. People thought that their children would live better, and they haven't, right? There's been a decline, a global decline, right? In the United States, we're not immune to this either. So I think that there is a real protest element, and that it's, I am sympathetic to it. I feel that it is correct, and my sympathy goes to the protesters, and those photographs touched me to no end when I saw them. I think it's also true in Kazakhstan, and this is what a lot of my research has been on, is that there's infighting in that regime. We can't think about it as a consolidated monolithic system. And I think Pauline said it so beautifully in regards to foreign policy, and Mirhat said so beautifully in regards to the regime. I think both of you used the term balancing act. Nazarbayev was not only excellent at balancing foreign policy, he was excellent at balancing all of these different elite groupings. He did not always succeed. We know this from different kinds of elites who've gone into the opposition. But for me, the most important element here is, and I'm speculating, I don't have evidence. I'm going to say what I think based on what I've studied. I feel that a lot of this has to do with the Nazarbayev family. So interesting that in a BBC interview that former Prime Minister Akizhan Kajageldin gave just yesterday, I think in the morning, he said, and the journalist pushed him, but he said, Almaty is the city of Nazarbayev's family. Nothing happens there without their permission. And I thought about it, and I have studied how Nazarbayev's family has caused a lot of infighting within the elite and has been a weak spot for President Nazarbayev. So I asked one of my friends who's in Almaty about this possibility, and they said, I walked in the streets on Wednesday night, and there was rioting and looting, and it was chaos, and I saw no police and I saw no military. Then on Thursday morning, all the rioters were gone. The peaceful protesters were back, and there was still nobody. There was no military, there was no one. That person also said that the buildings were not protected and that the airport was not protected. And that is why the destruction was allowed to happen. And it brought me back to the conversation, to the interview with Akishan Gelsin, and I was thinking there could be a connection there. And I don't have evidence for it to be so, but it is very strange that at the time when the rioting happened, there was no protection, and that protection came later. And that Kazakhstan is in some ways could be considered like a weak state, but in other ways it's not. I have been to protests in earlier times in Kazakhstan, and the police presence and the military presence and the, what is it called, the OMON presence was tangible, even in the most peaceful protests. So it is very strange to me that in this case of chaos and violence, that they would not also be there. So I think there's a lot of things happening here. It could be that the protests occurred and they were widespread across the country, and perhaps people, not Nazarbayev himself, but people close to him, including perhaps his family members, like they may have used that as an opportunity to stake their claim more forcefully and more powerfully to try to undermine President Tokayev, and it could have backfired. Now, these are all just my speculations, and there must be alternatives, but I would like to definitely give my respect and my honor to those brave people who went out and who used their voice, because that, I think when I think about even in democratic countries, it's not always easy to do that, right? But I think some other things are happening too, and I think it will become clearer what those fissures are in the government, and the fact that Masimov, was arrested, and the other cases that folks had given examples of also, I think, supports this idea that there are multiple levels of things happening, and that the state is trying to use it Tokayev is trying to use it to his advantage. And then my last comment is about terrorism. I think terrorism is it's a very convenient blanket, because you can say people on the streets are terrorists, and inside the government, there have been infiltrations of terrorists. And then you can take care of both problems at the same time under one umbrella. And then you can invite Russia, right? Because they're also afraid of terrorists. And then you can get sympathy from abroad, because everybody is, when it comes to the word terrorism, everyone is fighting against it. So those are my initial thoughts. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for your great comments. And let's now give the floor to Nargis.
Thank you very much, Marlene. And today is the day of mourning in Kazakhstan, and my heart also goes to all my compatriots and everybody there. So let me build on what my colleagues have been saying. Indeed, there are so many questions that need to be answered. But let's start with what we know as of now. Until last week, President Tokayev didn't have full power, and actually didn't have much power. He was surrounded by Nazarbayev clan people. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. He was appointed by Nazarbayev, and he was part of this political transition process. And we don't know what role he was assigned in this transition process, and whether there was a further plan. We also know that there was intra-elite struggle going on, and possibly it got intensified with the alleged worsening of Nursultan Nazarbayev's health. And we, of course, we don't know what plans these groups and how many groups have been entertaining. And we know, as Barbara mentioned, that some members of the political elites in the country, and especially members of his family, had pretty shady networks. Yeah, Barbara said that well, Bulat, for example, Bulat Nazarbayev, he controlled the bazaars in the Almaty Oblast, and Samat Abish, he was heading various sports associations, and we know what sports associations are in the post-Soviet space, and the kind of the banditry and the racket that is associated with it. We know that Kairat Satibaldi kind of he has been patronizing various Islamist networks, and at a certain point he even tried to create the Akorda Islamist movement. So we knew of this prior to these events. Now, last week, it's hard for me to believe that all these events, the chain of events, started only 7 days ago. So much has happened. But indeed, it all started with protests that spread like fire from Western Kazakhstan across the country, and the causes where all these grievances that have been accumulating, socioeconomic grievances, also the kind of disappointment with the government and with the mismanagement and corruption and all of that. So it's not surprising that this protest spread, given the worsening economic situation, given the pandemic. We know that some very strange things happened on the 4th and 5th of January. And that's something that will require major investigation. We know that there were mixed crowds in the streets of Almaty. There were kind of the protests that we usually see with political demands. We saw some people from the outskirts of Almaty. We hadn't seen these faces before. We definitely saw some criminal elements, really bandits, thugs, in big numbers in the city as well. And where they came from, where they mobilized by some forces, that's a big question. But it seems to me that it was orchestrated to some extent. The kind of this mobilization was orchestrated. Like so many things were going on. There was a protest. There was a genuine mobilization by kind of people who wanted some change, who were really sick and tired of what's happening in the country. But there was something more kind of much more sinister going on as well. And what Barbara mentioned, the big question is why the security forces left the city unprotected. My own mom, she saw the military trucks leaving, kind of going away from the center around 7, 8 in the morning on the 5th of January. And that's when there was this, big disorder in the streets already. So the city clearly was left completely unprotected. What was happening in Akorda at this moment? Yeah, that's when President Tokayev reaches out to President Putin and President Lukashenko and asks for help. So, and I think it sort of does make sense to me that if he didn't have much control with security forces, then inviting CSTO might have been the only the only choice he had at the time, no matter how tragic this decision is and how much it damages the reputation of the country as a sovereign state. On the 6th, the military came back. That's after the CSTO kind of decision. Well, the decision was made by the CSTO to send peacekeepers, right, to deal with the external terrorist act. And here, my take on it is that the kind of invoking kind of this external terrorist threat was the only kind of legitimate way to get the CSTO troops quickly into the country. We see that they are not really participating in any military operations on the ground. So I think that their role was primarily symbolic. That's my take on it. We'll see. I think they will leave fairly soon, and the kind of the arrival signal to political elites that President Tokayev has the support of Russia, of President Putin, and it was, of course, a signal to the outside world, that Russia is in charge. There is Russia's sphere of influence, and when there is a crisis, Russia will take care of it. So okay, a little bit digressing, but I think they had to do it. They had to say that it was an external terrorist attack for political expediency, but not with regard to protesters, but more kind of to get the excuse, the kind of legitimate reasons to bring Russian support. So, and already we see the changing narrative. Well, the new state secretary, Yerlan Karin, for example, he gave an interview, I guess today in Kazakhstan to Vlast KZ. And he said that it was a conspiracy of domestic actors with the participation of some external destructive forces. So already we see this kind of shift of the emphasis on domestic actors, and we do see that some top people are being detained, and so on and so forth, and we see some suicides already, of KNB people, and so on and so forth. So what next? As I already mentioned, I think CSTO forces will leave. I don't think they will stay, because it would be a huge problem for Tokayev and his government. I think it served its purpose already. So it's definitely it was kind of a win for President Putin. But I don't think they will stay. It's definitely kind of not an invasion or anything like that. I think there will be we will see reforms, at least an attempt to carry out reforms, particularly socioeconomic reforms, because I think there is understanding at all levels that the country is in a very bad shape. And it's now the situation is explosive. So President Tokayev keeps talking about these reforms. We'll see what package he will put together. And if the most predatory elite members are removed from the system, maybe there is a chance. And if the good people are put in charge of the reforms, then maybe we do have a chance. And maybe then the kind of all the losses and the trauma of last week will not be in vain. As for political reforms, he promises political reforms. I don't know how much how much we can deliver in this department, but I think there is kind of an intention is there. But of course, we shouldn't forget that it's not a complete overhaul of the system. We're not dealing with the revolution. These are the kind of the same people, but kind of different group in the same system who will be trying to do these things. And definitely there are kind of it's hard to change ways overnight. Yeah, and that's why we hear some strange rhetoric and some the propaganda in this highly embarrassing case with the Kyrgyz musician who was kind of shown on TV as if he is this kind of hired foreigner to destabilize, kind of used to destabilize Kazakhstan. So there will be an attempt to introduce new ways, but of course the old ways, they still hold strong on the system. And for me, the most worrying, kind of what really worries me today is to think how the kind of development of the political system proceed from now on. Whether the political elites will be able to find some kind of equilibrium that is good for the country, for the stability of the country, or not. The latest events showed that the past decade shows that our elites are not in the best shape. Our political elites definitely we're not thinking of the public interest, of the national interest. So I do hope that people kind of more public interest minded, more national interest minded will kind of will come up, and we'll see. So there is a lot of worry, but also some hope that I think we have now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nargis, for also these great comments. I mean, all of you were really great in bringing together very different pieces and trying to be very reasonable and cautious about what we know, what we think we know, what we are just speculating, what we are interpreting. So I wanted to really thank you all for this great presentation. We now have time for a question, and as you may have seen, there are like just a ton of them in the chat box. So I will try to kind of summarize the key ones and try to put them together in kind of a thematical package. Maybe we can begin with the foreign policy aspect and then move back to the domestic aspect. You already, all of you mentioned several of these elements, and Nargis especially. A lot of questions coming in the chat about Russia's motivation. So far, the CSTO never accepted a request. It's the first time that the CSTO is indeed replying positively to a request. So why, in that case, Moscow felt that he had to intervene? Some people are asking whether that kind of conspiracy, like Russia knew something would happen and was participating, or how can we discuss the perception also from the Russian side, and of course question about Russia's positioning in the positioning, and much more cautious, of course, and how we can interpret that. Pauline was mentioning that Kazakhstan is kind of moving even more than before to the Russia-China fall. But if we could have some of the speakers' comments on both Russia's motivation to intervene and then China's position would be great. And then maybe after we can move back to the domestic field. Which of you would like to take these two questions on Russia and China?
Me? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, please.
So, sorry, I think I interrupted Mirhat. Okay, I'm going to take a Russia and China question. I think that Russia's and China's relations in Central Asia and the so-called competition between Russia and China in Central Asia was a little bit over-exaggerated in the informational sphere. And I think that what happened in Kazakhstan and what happened earlier in Tajikistan with regard to Afghanistan shows us that Russia and China cooperate more in Central Asia than compete, actually. For China, number one priority in Central Asia is stability. And right now, China doesn't care whether the stability will be reached in Kazakhstan with Kazakh's own internal forces, or Russia, which is a very good China's partner, will come and make the situation stable. China doesn't need to have a very, hectic, unpredictable country on its border with Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is a very, very sensitive region from the point of view of Beijing. I think that China is totally okay with Russia's position in Central Asia, and it will not take any real actions towards it.
I quite agree with that, and I just wanted to add that in this situation, if you noticed, Kyrgyzstan, which sent just a small number of troops there, in the beginning was hesitating to do it. There was some parliament members, not willingly coming to this session and stuff, but Putin made them send troops there anyway. It seems to me that for Putin it's very important that CSTO is one, and even symbolic participation is important, and it might be a very good tactic, so very good idea for Putin today, especially when we're talking about the escalation of tension along the Ukrainian border. If Russia, which is now being discussed, even today there was a discussions between Biden and Putin about Ukraine. If Russia starts military operations against Ukraine, it will be not Russia, but several countries fighting against Ukraine. That might be easily an issue, because Russia helped Tokayev, and now Tokayev, as a member of the CSTO, has to help Russia. Other CSTO member states took part in this operation in Kazakhstan. Now they're supposed to take part in any other operations Russia is leading. So that's very important here. And as for Chinese thing, I just want to remind you that Kazakhs have a very interesting, very useful saying that if you have a Russian friend, have your military acts ready. But they also have another proverb saying, if mass of Chinese come, Red Russian will be like your father. So, and Chinese know about it. They will never send troops there because Chinese are an ethnic group, unfortunately. I'm not a racist or something, but there is a huge kind of rejection of Chinese in Central Asia in general, especially in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. People don't like Chinese. There were so many protests against Chinese and stuff historically. And Chinese, they know it. They don't need to enter there. They need stability, and I agree with that. And they want to make money in a very stable country. How the stability is there, they don't care.
Can I add something, Marlene, or was there another?
Thank you, yeah, of course, Pauline, please.
Thank you. I just want to say, I just to the question of why Russia was so quick to support the intervention, albeit through the CSTO, and some might want to compare it to Kyrgyzstan and why Russia wasn't willing to intervene last October. I think that the stakes are just much higher. I think it's kind of clear. They're higher in terms of the instability in Kazakhstan, because it is such a big, important economy, because of its oil wealth, because of its border, its very long border with Russia and with China, as my colleagues mentioned, and then just demographically, the fact that there are a sizable Russian population. So I think the stakes are just much higher. That made the decision much easier.
Thanks, Pauline. Barbara, would you like to add something on that?
Nargis can go. Go ahead,
Yes.
Nargis.
Yes. I think the cost-benefit analysis was different in case of Kazakhstan, right, compared to Kyrgyzstan and Armenia, because the costs, the costs were not that high actually, right? Well, sending 2,000, troops, it's not such a big deal, especially if you don't think they will be in harm's way, So I think kind of there was understanding that Kazakh forces can manage the situation, right? And indeed, that's what we see. They are kind of not engaged in military activities. These are Kazakh forces that are managing the situation. Yeah. And that would have been very different if Russian soldiers were sent to deal with the interethnic conflict in southern Kyrgyzstan, right? Or if they were sent on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. But the benefits were very big. So I think they made an assessment, and I think they were convinced by President Tokayev that the situation is very serious, right? So yeah, that's how it happened quickly. And it's interesting to read the Lukashenko's President Lukashenko's account of these talks. As usual, he's the most outspoken.
Thank you all. Let's now move. There is another series of questions, maybe this time also on the kind of the Russian intervention, but seen from the outside, from the inside, of Kazakhstan. One question about how can we speculate on the motivation for Tokayev to call Russia for help? Nargis mentioned maybe the impression that he wouldn't be able to control what was happening with the intra-elite, so as a way to showcase that he had the support of Russia and not the other part of the elite. So it would be interesting to get the feedback of other speakers if they have. And also a question we have about the population reaction toward that presence of Russia and what it means symbolically in terms of symbolic sovereignty, especially toward the Kazakh-speaking part of the population. So how do you think the regime will be then able to balance this kind of symbolic loss of sovereignty, especially toward the Kazakh-speaking part of the population? And then we will move more to regimes and protest gradually with the next round of questions. Who would like to take this kind of two questions?
I can start if no one else wants. I think that I've talked to some of my friends from Kazakhstan, and according to what I see in social media, I don't think there are many Kazakh people who are Kazakhstani people who are happy with Russian forces in Kazakhstan, and the success of this campaign here from the Russian point of view depends on whether Tokayev and his all informational campaign right now will succeed in making sure that people believe that this was international terrorist attack. If he manages to reach this theory to be believed by the majority of people in Kazakhstan, I think people will understand that this was something that Tokayev had to do. He had to call to Moscow for help because it was a very, very serious case, and Kazakhstan's own forces didn't have enough capacity to fight international terrorism. So I think this is the only way Russia can, gain some kind of support from the people in Kazakhstan.
Maybe I can add.
Thanks, Timur. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, the reaction was negative. The initial reaction was negative, right? We saw it on social media because exactly symbolically, it's bad, right? We have protests and kind of some disorder, and then the leadership invites Russians, right? And indeed, kind of only last month we celebrated 30 years of independence with with a lot of pomp, right? And we kind of thought of ourselves as this kind of not great power, but sort of medium power, right? And well-to-do and overachiever and in the region, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, kind of you have a crisis, and immediately you invite the Russians. But overall, kind of de facto, of course, there had been dependence, security dependence on Russia, right? So I think it's kind of, but it wasn't that obvious, right? The prior to this crisis to people. Now we kind of know more about it, but overall, I have a feeling now it's already kind of the Tokayev's image is improved, right? It's improving like by the day with kind of the restoration of order, and next week, if the package of kind of, if he appoints the relatively decent people into the government, if he announces like some meaningful reforms, and actually if they start getting implemented, I think he can gain a lot of legitimacy. The expectations are growing by the hour in the country. So yes, it was a blow to the reputation. It was a blow kind of to the self-image. But since actually the Russian troops were not participating in suppression of protests, and kind of they stay aside and guard the infrastructure, whatever, kind of now it's mitigated, and we'll see.
Thank you, Dewey. Mehat, would you like to speak on that?
Yeah, in the beginning, of course, it was, especially among the lack of sufficient information, it was like similar to many people, it considered as similar what happened in Belarus when, well, the troops were probably not sent, but Putin obviously supported Belarusian dictator Lukashenko and stuff like that. And it was a very hard for Kazakhstanis for Kazakhs, especially Kazakh speakers, to accept that. Everything will depend upon what's going to happen in future. And unfortunately for Tokayev, even if the reforms are done and the elections are made, are held in future, he might lose because of this. It's going to be a big damage in his reputation. It's better now, probably, but still, many Kazakhs already. I heard several places where people were just in a very strong traditional Kazakh way saying that his ancestors and his Tokayev's sons and grandchildren must be condemned forever by Kazakhs. So this is very serious for people who suffered all this hullabaloo and chaos in Almaty. Of course, what's happening now it's good sign and everything is okay. But people in Zhanaozen, I'm not sure that they will ever forget this, and I'm not sure that they will forgive. Let's say that Tokayev. For them, it is Tokayev invited Russians to deal with the protest. They don't care if the Russian troops or Armenian, Tajik troops, many Russian troops, Belarusian troops, they just guarded the objects. If they're guarding the objects, the question is why you were inviting them. If they're not doing anything, just guarding the objects, why are you inviting them? And then Russian television showed huge number of vehicles, military personnel moving from Orenburg area to entering Kazakhstan and stuff. So this will be very hard to forget, and that might damage Tokayev's reputation for a long time, if not forever, especially among Kazakh-speaking regions. It's west, southwest, southern part of Kazakhstan.
Thank you so much, Mehrat, and all of you. We have also a lot of questions that are more about kind of intra-elite politics. And here, I guess we only have to speculate about what we can imagine is happening. So we have questions about, does that mean that Nazarbayev is now politically dead, that his family is politically dead? And what does that mean for the part of the family that is very economically in charge of many things, like Kulibayev? What do we know about the possible kind of Islamist connection or whatever may have been related to kind of grooming Islamists at home? So that's the kind of a lot of questions are kind of going around these two issues. What is happening with the Nazarbayev family, the Nazarbayev clan? Do we have any clan issues here also at stake, or should we use other terminology to discuss what is happening, and whatever for this kind of Islamist aspect that is emphasized by the propaganda, but seems very modest on the ground, but still maybe it's not totally absent. So if you could also comment on these different aspects, and then we will have a last round of question on the protesters themselves. Who would like to begin on the Nazarbayev family, the kind of intra-elite fight and the Islamist aspect?
Well, I think it's a big exaggeration that Nazarbayev's family, in fact, members of his family tried to, cherish or grew up some Islamist cells or Islamist or fundamental Islamist groups in Kazakhstan. I don't think it's a very serious allegation. The thing is that Kairat Satybaldy, yes, he's religious. He wants to show, that he's religious. But for me, it always looked like he was wanted just to show how religious he is, and he was. I'm not sure. Yeah, he had some groups. He had some. He financed some groups who propagated Islam, which was like a sign of coming back to the roots after the Soviet past. I'm not sure that, yes, the Nazarbayev's family controlled everything in the country, especially Almaty and the southern part of the country, but not only. Nazarbayev's family was controlling all aspects of life in Kazakhstan, for sure. Directly or indirectly, that's 100%, but I'm not sure that they anything about Islam. Yeah, Nazarbayev went to Hajj, to Mecca. Yes, he went there. His family members went there too. But Nazarbayev also, his family members also met the Pope, John Paul II. Very huge, big event. The John Paul II came to Kazakhstan. I don't remember the exact year, but the family members met with him, no problem. There's nothing about fundamentalism. We have to remember that this family is from the Soviet past. I mean, they cannot be behind any really Islamic fundamentalists or Islamic kind of groups or supporting Islamists or something. I don't think this is an issue here.
Can I add?
Thank you, Mehrat. And Nargis?
Yeah, well,
yes.
It's quite a family, right? I think there is a good amount of diversity there. What they have in common, I think, is the unbounded greed.
Yeah.
It seems no matter how much money they had, how much power. Sorry, I didn't sleep much over the week. They had it wasn't enough, and definitely they all had big political ambitions as well. And not all of them were religious, obviously, but well, Kairat Satybaldy definitely was seen as a major patron of Islamists in Kazakhstan, and I think he did have political ambitions, you know, using these kind of networks, this kind of base. You know, I already mentioned the Akorda movement that he launched, and it was a big thing at the time. I think it was 2008, but now I don't remember exactly. But, and even the the Mufti of Kazakhstan was present at the opening of this, at the launch of this movement. But and we also had kind of reports of Islamist groups inside the security services. So something was brewing there, and it's not, you know, kind of, it's not news, you know, to to people who kind of were observing Kazakh political scene. So some say, okay, if it was a coup, why it was so kind of dysfunctional and you know, kind of, aren't they kind of smarter people to do things in a smart way? I'm not sure they are smart people, you know. Actually, I don't think they're particularly smart people in the family. And Nazarbayev is a talented guy, obviously. You know, he's you know, he was an extremely bright politician, but then, you know, sort of went down.
Thank you, Nargis. Would Timur or Pauline comment also on these questions?
Sure, I'll just say a couple of things quickly. I think Nargis alluded to this in her earlier remarks. The best case scenario for Tokayev is to get the Nazarbayev family out. When I said the second exit was complete, I meant complete from him himself. His family, of course, I think there are some lingering, obviously some lingering aspects there, but I think Tokayev's going to do everything he can and use whatever legitimacy he can rebuild with the elite to literally cleanse the country of Nazarbayev's informal influence. He's already formally done much of that. In terms of Islamists, I agree with Nargis has said earlier about it being a very convenient label to use. Islamist terrorists, both to activate the CSTO very quickly, but I think also to some degree, I don't know if this was anticipated. I actually don't think Tokayev is strategic and smart as some seem to think he is. I think he was very reactive. I think he panicked at the situation and was very reactive and didn't think things through, but that might be another theme for a presentation. So I won't go into that too much, but I think that, you know, he uses these labels conveniently to also legitimize himself internationally with, you know, sort of why this is happening. And then domestically, I think if he can convince people that it really was these foreign terrorists who hijacked these peaceful protesters, that they're to blame and not him. So.
Can I add one thing, like 30 seconds?
Yeah,
Marlene?
Of course.
I think, yeah, actually it was already mentioned that the family and, you know, kind of the clan, they control a lot of assets, in the country. And I think it'll be kind of, we'll understand a lot when we see what's going to happen to these assets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points. We now have like 10 minutes left, and I would like to go back on the protesters themselves, and because they are the core, maybe one of the core issue, and something that will not disappear like that, because they are coming with claims, and these claims will need to be addressed in one way or another, or there will be a new wave of street protests. So we have several questions about the structural reasons for protest, how potentially the more kind of social economic issue that we have seen in the Western region could cooperate with the maybe more political aspect that we have seen in other cities. We remember the 2019 protests at the moment of the change of president that were kind of brought by a more kind of urban middle classes, more about political liberalization. And so how do you see the future of this kind of both the social, economic and the political protests? Can they merge in one kind of bigger movement? Should we talk about movement or about just very different groups and claims that are not coordinated? Do we see any coordination arriving, kind of something that would look like a movement, or we should continue to speak about several different issues or grievances that are happening in different cities without necessarily the coordination? And of course, there was also a question about, do we see any figures emerging in terms of leading this kind of more grassroots movement? So it's a lot for the last 10 minutes we have, but I would like to give you the floor for this really, I think, key question. And we will have another session specifically on the protests and this question, because it's really very important one, but we can begin discussing that right now. Who would like to begin?
I'll start. I think here we have to again recollect Ukraine, compare Ukraine and Belarus. In Belarus, we know that there was no leaders. There were no leaders. Even Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who de facto won the election, she said openly, publicly, several times in the beginning, I don't want to be a president. The only thing I want is to hold a new presidential election. There was no coordinated center. That's why, most likely, that's why the revolution failed. In Ukraine, all the opposition groups, they forgot about differences. They were together and they did something which still there, and the reforms are underway, and they got rid of the corrupt President Yanukovych and stuff, and we know all the developments. Here in Kazakhstan, it's like more like in Belarus. There is no one coordinating center here. We have Mukhtar Ablazov, who is not very popular in many parts of Kazakhstan. There are some people who follow him, but he was discredited by Kazakh propaganda. He also is a person who promised not to be involved in politics. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2002, and then in 2 months after, he was forgiven by Nazarbayev and promised to not to go into politics. And for ordinary Kazakhs, you gave a word, and now you're just doing something. This is very specific. Opposition, well, there is no one consolidated. There are human rights groups there. There are independent journalists there who try to do something. There are civil rights activists, but there is no one coordinating point of a strong opposition. And that's why if there are some kind of protests in future, there might be something which appear now, I don't know, but at this point, as we speak now, I don't see that if any kind of protests erupt again in Kazakhstan, something like what happened last week might happen again in the nearest future.
Thank you, Mirhat. Pauline, Nargis? Yes, Nargis.
Oh, I would second that. It's very localized at the moment, I think, and demands are localized, except for the kind of, we want, the government should go, and the slogan "Shall Get" was kind of across the country. And on the one hand, that's kind of, it's easier to suppress these things, but at the same time, when it gets big, the way we saw last week, whom do they talk to? Whom do they negotiate with? So there is there are no channels, and I think they are kind of. You hear that from some, top level people and some deputies that okay, we do need to create something. We do need some political reforms and create the channels for communication. So, but we'll see it. It will take time because it was so purged the field that it will take time for grass and flowers to grow. But I think now things are happening so fast that I will not be surprised if within the year we'll have a different situation.
Thank you. Timur, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I want just to conclude by saying that Kazakhstan will continue to be a object of our interest for the nearest future, but for now, for us now, it's very, very important to filter the information that we get from Kazakhstan, and to make sure that we don't believe in different narratives that are spread right now across Kazakhstan by different sources. There are so many theories about what is going on and what will happen, that I think we should be very, very accurate in picking this information.
Yeah, that's a great point, Timur. Thank you. Pauline, would you like to add something and conclude?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I just want to say that I think we shouldn't have been so surprised by what's happened over the past week. If we were sort of paying attention, like I said, since roughly 2015, 2014, there have been an increasing number of protests, and the protests have scaled up and they've spread. I think Kazakh activists, you're right, they don't have a leadership, they don't have a real organization, but in face of obstacles, great obstacles to a vibrant civil society, they have been learning, and they have been, building, and I think they'll continue to build. If Tokayev does not take on real serious political and economic reform, and I'm more doubtful than Nargis is in this. I think he's had lots of opportunities to do this, and we haven't seen him take on this reform. But if he fails to do that, we will see future uprisings, and particularly around election time. So that's why I'm looking at 2023, where local elections are supposed to be held, in 2024, the presidential elections, to see what happens.
Great. Well, I think on that, we will be able to conclude. It has been really wonderful, and I wanted to thank you, all of you, for giving us your comments, and all of you trying to stay very modest in what we know, and as Timur was saying, how we have to filter information and also be careful about the lenses we are using to interpret what is happening. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, all of the 500 people we had with us today, for the very lively discussion. A lot of warm feelings sent to all those of you who have close families and friends and colleagues in Kazakhstan, and we will be reconvening probably in a few days, early next week, for other events, hopefully with our Kazakh friends based in Kazakhstan, once internet will be able to be totally restored. So once again, thank you to all of you, and hope to be continuing our discussion very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.